So Dawn Butler was invited along with Simon Clarke onto Sky News to discuss a bunch of the potential recommendations that are going to be made in statutory guidance from the Equality and Human Rights Commission over access to single-sex spaces with regards to what happened with trans men, trans women, and non-binary people as well. So this was the discussion that was had, and the end is quite shocking. Let's watch.
If trans men then have to use women's toilets, that's going to make women less safe, because how are you going to stop a man, a normal man, going into a woman's toilets and saying, I'm a trans man? And so I think we have to look at
I don't follow that logic.
Why?
Because the point is that we're saying that people who are biologically men shouldn't be using women's toilets. That's the point of this ruling, among other things.
But a trans man is biologically a woman.
Someone who's transitioned from being a woman to a man is...
And so they would then have to use women's toilets.
I think this...
And that is the person that they have got on as a theoretical political expert to talk about this issue, chat. Look at the face. Look at his face, just realising the dawn of realisation as he realises he hasn't got a clue what he's talking about. Genuinely does not actually have a singular clue what he's talking about. Because first of all, he doesn't know what the difference is between a trans man and a trans woman. He doesn't know what those words mean. I.e., a trans man is someone who is assigned female at birth, right? Because, of course, at no point in any of these discussions does anybody ever think about the fact that, trans men exist. Trans men are part of this discussion. We only ever hear about this in terms of trans women when these discussions happen. So it's not even gone into his brain at any point that maybe there might be some negative externalities from their desire to punish trans women. Again, for the crimes of cisgender men, of course, But trans women are the only people they have in their mind. They don't even realise that trans men exist. The people assigned female at birth, when they transition, they take testosterone, they grow beards, and in most cases are basically impossible to clock, which is, for people who don't know, to understand that someone may be presenting as a certain gender but may be assigned a different gender at birth, right? If you can see that someone is trans, quote unquote, that is clocking them. The vast majority of trans men who go through hormone replacement therapy and go on testosterone are completely unclockable. Totally 100% unclockable. And yet, what happens with this, and again, he also doesn't realise that what we're talking about here is the potential statutory guidance from the Equality and Human Rights Commission. They would be the ones who would decide on what the guidance is over public facilities and how they get used by people based upon their gender and their gender assigned at birth, right? It's not the statutory guidance that he's discussing here. He talks about the ruling by the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court ruling has nothing to do with who uses what toilets, has nothing to do with who uses what changing rooms. It's about how you apply the Equality Act over things like all-female shortlists, for example. And it thinks that women in that context is people who are assigned female at birth, It was nothing to do with how people are taught to use each different facility. Facilities weren't covered in the UK Supreme Court ruling. That is about the Equality and Human Rights Commission's future statutory guidance on this particular issue. So he doesn't know that, for starters. And then second of all, when even first thought to contemplate the idea of what happens if all people assigned female at birth are forced to use women's toilets, he literally goes silent. The whole studio goes totally silent because they've not even bothered comprehending this. And whether our journalists and our elected politicians have not bothered to conceive of what happened with this issue, and yet they get a privileged position to talk about this issue in the public sphere. This was on Sky News's premier mainstream political discussion show, which is Politics Hub with Sophie Rich, their flagship vehicle for political discussion. They get people on deliberately to discuss the potential impacts over both the UK Supreme Court ruling and potential statutory guidance from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and they neither have a fucking clue what they're talking about. Neither Simon Clarke nor Sophie Ridge had any answer to this, to the point at which they first get asked to comprehend this and they go totally silent. Because, of course, the other negative externality is even if trans men aren't forced to use women's facilities, which of course the Equality and Human Rights Commission statutory guidance might not do, there is a potential with regards to the Equality and Human Rights Commission statutory guidance that trans people might not be able to use either, because they would be deemed too passing to use the one of their assigned sex at birth, and they would be considered not passing enough to use the one of their quote-unquote acquired gender as per the Supreme Court ruling, right? So the Equality and Human Rights Commission said potentially they might have to use their lobbying power for third gendered or ungendered spaces for trans people to use, essentially shutting trans people out of public life unless facilities all create new genderless facilities or trans-specific facilities for everybody, which is of course a totally ridiculous ruling. And they've not even bothered to think about what the impact of that might be. Not only is it traumatizing for lots of trans people, it is totally unworkable, and of course this will also impact gender non-conforming cisgender people as well, because people aren't going to be making snap decisions about what facilities people use under potential new EHRC statutory guidance, because you're not going to be able to ask people to provide birth certificates to prove their assigned sex at birth, because your passport and driving license can be changed without a GRC, in order to be able to access these facilities. No one's carrying their birth certificate with them to be able to use these facilities. That's an insane proposal. So what is the other option? People are going to be making snap judgments on what people look like. The only other way they would know is by doing like genital inspections for people who haven't had assignment surgery, for example, and that's not happening either. So literally the only way people are making judgments on what facilities people should or shouldn't be using is going to be by looking at people and clocking them. So what's this going to lead to? Gender non-conforming people of both genders, but primarily gender non-conforming cisgender women. So people like butch lesbians, for example. These people will end up being accosted and accused of being transgender when they are not. This already happens to cisgender butch lesbians, for example. Somebody was refused entrance to a Marks and Spencer's female toilet despite being a cisgender woman because she was too masculine. She was perceived to be too masculine. This is the end result of what these EHRC statutory guidance reforms could potentially do if they are written in the way that Kishore Faulkner has teased that they will be, because they're trying to expedite this guidance, you know? And that's the thing, is that you can change your passport non-binary to be of your new gender even without a GRC, right? I could go and get a letter from my doctor tomorrow saying that I'm certainly going to be living in my new gender for the rest of my life, and take that letter to the passport office and get a new passport with female written on it tomorrow if I wanted to do that, you know? I'd be able to apply for that as long as my doctor could give that recommendation to the passport office. That doesn't require a gender recognition. That doesn't require a gender recognition certificate, which is the document that actually would update your birth certificate to change from your sex assigned at birth to your acquired gender, right? So nothing works in this situation unless you're checking birth certificates or you're checking people's genitals. And neither of these things are going to happen. The only thing they're going to be able to do is make judgments on who they can clock or who they can't. And despite the fact that literally every single one of these gender critical types claims they can always tell, they just can't. They just cannot, right? Especially when it comes to trans men. Because what's going to stop, as Dawn Butler points out, the cisgender men that people admit that they're scared of from pretending to be trans men and then trying to gain access to female spaces that way by saying, well, this is what the statutory guidance said I should do. So at the end of the day, it's completely unworkable. No one who's had any prominence to discuss this issue has got a fucking clue what they're talking about, especially not Simon Clarke or Sophie Ridge. Because they don't know what a trans man is, they don't know what the statutory guidance is going to be or what the Supreme Court ruling even says, and they haven't even bothered to think about the negative externalities before being invited to discuss it on the prime-time flagship Sky News political discussion programme. Insane stuff.